So it should be recording.
Right. So this is a Cap versus KS lecture by Aidan Cap K One Trick Etkin. I don't have like a lot of time to go over like the theoretical background for most of these arguments. So I'll just do like a reading list at the end and recommend some rounds to watch. But I'll mostly just be going over what I think is strategic about this argument, how I think it can be applied to debate, and common Affs responses that there are pretty good answers to. So I guess like there are four main reasons I can think of why this case is strategic. The first reason is that obviously it has extinction impacts. This makes framing the debate really easy for you because your offense, i.e. impact, most of the time will outweigh theirs, i.e. It has a higher magnitude because something like nuclear war, fascism, or global warming kills net more people than whatever impact the 1AC has isolated. That means all you have to win is a risk of a link or alt solvency. And what that means basically is that it's like try or die for the alternative, because even if the Aff is like really convincing on why it might fail, any risk it can stop an impact as large as extinction is sufficient to vote negative. The second reason is that Aff teams lack nuance. Most of the people who read the CapK just stick it in the 1NC as a time suck and rarely go for it. That's why 2ACs, because they need to prep multiple arguments, will almost always lack the hyper-specific evidence and answers that they usually have on framework. And they'll also just spend less time against the K, which makes sandbagging in the block really easy. Like I've gone through this K probably every neg round versus K Affs, and the 2AC has still spent more time on framework than they have on cap, even though I never go for that. The third reason the cap K is strategic is the sheer amount of literature. Obviously, everyone knows the phrase, a jack of all trades is master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. There are obviously Ks that have really specific links to certain Affs, but I don't think that anyone here has like the time or energy to prep out entire files for every 1AC they see. That's not a sustainable strategy unless the team who reads it like keeps beating you, they're like your mortal enemy, arch nemesis, or they're just your biggest threat at a given tournament. Not only does a CapK virtually link to every single Aff, but Marxists also just write about literally everything, so finding cards will never be an issue. Also, they'll write your links for you. You don't need to really do a lot of thinking. There's like a million articles critiquing the affirmatives that you see in debate, i.e. there are Marxist critiques of Afropess, postmodernism, Baudrillard, etc., that you can just Google, read, and turn into a link block. The fourth reason the CapK is strategic is just perception. Most people who read the CapK are really bad at it. They're not watching this lecture, so that's not going to get a lot better. And judges are tired of hearing the same wrong, class first, affect bad, you talk about identity style links. Those are astrategic and lack the sort of analysis and nuance you actually need to win these rounds. The threshold for giving a good cap speech is so low that even if you're not the best to ever do it, you'll still get rewarded for just like doing anything more in depth than just getting up and being like, but communism is good and the Aff is bad, so vote nay. So there are two main impacts with the CapK. The first one is fascism, and I think this one's probably more strategic for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that farther left K judges love this impact because it's like very concrete and easy to visualize. The second reason is that there's clear external offense, and what external offense means is that affirmatives usually won't be able to access their impact. They lack the explanatory power to sort of describe why fascists are rising in the status quo, but your K doesn't. Right? So you solve, they don't. That's an easy way to compare offense. The turns case analysis with this impact is really easy to do. The argument that I go for is that the collapse of capitalism emboldens fascist elites to seize power, and that requires them to do things like mobilize extremist right-wing groups, scapegoat marginalized populations, which obviously not only leads to all the impacts that Aff thinks are bad, but also means that the Aff probably can't solve in a world where fascists have actually taken power, which you can use as an argument to establish why the alternative is a prerequisite. It also helps the K tie together. A big issue that people who read not just the CapK, but most Ks have, is that it feels really hodgepodge, like your overview, links, and alt are like very loosely connected. And that's sort of bad because the whole reason that Ks are persuasive is because it's a narrative, a story about the 1AC that helps you recharacterize it and use that to get the ballot. So fascism is really easy to do that with because you have a very clear impact story about why capitalism mobilizes fascists, a very clear link story about why whatever the affirmative does either can't confront fascism on a large enough scale or something by fascists in a way the alternative doesn't, and a really persuasive alt explanation that's like, we need certain mechanisms for accountability to stop things like fascist infiltration. And I'll talk about that later. And the third reason is that it's a really good response to 2AC defense. A lot of Affs make this argument on util that's just like, yeah, but X people are already dying in the status quo. And obviously this argument's not very persuasive, but you can also just get up and be like, yeah, you can win that there are a lot of Black people who die in the status quo, but obviously a world of fascism is a lot worse, which proves that our impacts have uniqueness, meaning that, like, you know, the fact that things can still get worse is a reason you should vote negative. That's basically it. The second impact is warming. Honestly, I think this one is less strategic. Unless you're going for a style of the capcade that's just like the Affs says that the state is always bad. We think the state is good. It's key to like large scale infrastructural redevelopment like renewables, which are necessary to solve warming. That's usually not very persuasive to judges because the state good, state bad debate is very stale and probably Aff leaning. And usually Affs will just make the argument that's just like, our Aff says that engaging the state in terms of XYZ policy is bad. We didn't say that renewables are bad, so the perm shields your link. I also think the reason that it's less strategic than fascism is that saying the earth gets too hot or the biosphere will collapse paints a lot less of a vivid picture. And there aren't really any tricks that are specific to warming that you can't accomplish with fascism. And what I mean by painting a less vivid picture is that there's a very compelling impact story to be told with fascism. There's a clear internal link about how fascists get power, how they mobilize, what they do, and what that results in. But that's a little bit harder for warming because it's a little bit shoddy to just be like, yeah, well, the earth increases like 3 degrees Celsius, gets super hot, and everyone dies. That's not as concrete as you would sort of want your impact to be. And another reason I think that fascism is especially strategic on this topic is that it's very related to the military. Obviously, fascists taking over institutions in the US leads to a massive increase in military power and probably NATO power, which means literally every impact argument the 2AC made probably flows negative. And this is also an example of a turns case argument. Another reason fascism is a very persuasive impact is that it's a good way to frame your links. An argument that I really like to go for is that we need collective organizing now, because when fascists seize power or in the process of seizing power, they'll like get resources and use them to win people over, right? Which makes the mutual exclusivity between the alternative and the affirmative a lot clearer, because it's fundamentally now just a question of, do we want communism or do we want fascism? Which is like one of the more popular ways of articulating the CAPK. And if you're curious about how that works, there's a round online where Reed from Wake HV goes for it versus Rutgers. That round is probably a must watch. Reed's probably like the best CAPK debater ever. And just like transcribe their blogs and you'll be in a really good spot, probably. Do you have any questions before I move on to the links? Like, all right, I'll take that as a no. So I know there's a lot on screen and I wouldn't bother reading any of it because I'm just going to go in a ramble. But I think there are two main links that I go for with the CAPK that are very persuasive against most affirmatives. The first link, and this is probably my favorite, is the folk politics or idealism link, which is in the file on the Discord. It's the one in C. Chernikek and Williams evidence. So a lot of people misconceptualize this link, and that's both bad for the people who read the CAPK and good for the people. Well, I guess it's like bad if you misconceptualize it and you're neg, but it's good because Aff teams will rarely respond to it correctly. They'll have some sort of answer like affect first gets shielded by the perm, but you should understand this is not a link argument to affect first. The argument that this card is making is that any praxis or strategy or form of knowledge production that is abstracted from material action is bad, i.e., absent strategic goals or things like revolutionary planning, politics just becomes a ritualistic experience, which is a line the card uses, where people do things like the 1AC only for the sake of doing them, not actually because they want to overturn any structures of power. And a more in-depth argument you can make that allows you to characterize this link more offensively is by saying the Aff uses these sort of appeals to ethics, i.e. relationality being good or XYZ being good, as a way to fundamentally mask their absence of strategy. And this is a bit of a tangent, but the most important thing you need to do with the link is to win a recharacterization of the affirmative. The Aff will say they do something, you'll say they do something else. And a way to help you win your explanation of the Aff is by pointing to specific moments in cross-ex or speeches that you have to characterize not as sort of, you know, accidents or strategic mistakes that the Aff team might be making, but rather as the logical end result of their politics. And a good way to do that with this link argument is you ask them questions in cross-ex about material solvency. So Affs will usually have a card that's like, we produce XYZ form of knowledge, or this is why our praxis is good. You have to force them to articulate what that actually materializes as. And if they're unable to explain to you why their praxis turns into some sort of concrete movement, or if they just like straight up try to go for the impact turn and just say creating praxis is good, you can use that as a performative example of the link argument. And that will be a little bit clearer later. An example that the card gives to substantiate this link argument is usually Occupy Wall Street. And essentially what happened there is a bunch of people got together, protested, and when the state asked them, okay, fine, what do you want? They weren't actually able to articulate any strategic demands because the focus of their political strategy wasn't overturning systems of power or structural change. It was protesting itself, i.e. a feel-good politics where we protest for the sake of protesting, not for any broader strategic goal, which I think is like the TLDR of this card. Another example. Oh, sorry.
And I had two questions.
Sure.
First, can you explain what affect is? And second, can you explain what praxis is?
Sure. So obviously, it's very nuanced. Like affect is a term that comes from the laws, I believe, but that's not how we use it in debate. So if they're using it wrong, you don't have to use it right either. Essentially, what I mean by affect, praxis, knowledge production is this sort of strategy that 1EC has proposed. They've argued that reading the 1EC or their political strategy produces a particular form of knowledge that should be used to guide action. And that is what praxis is. Praxis is something like a framework for organizing or a sort of strategy for people to adopt in order to achieve some sort of change. And what's the second question?
That was both. I asked what affect was and what praxis
was. So you can use, when you think of affect, you can just think of, when you think affect, think immaterial. Like the way that you set up this distinction specifically in CAF versus KF debates is that there's a difference between affect, which is immaterial. It's a way of relating. It's a way of producing knowledge, versus material action, which is by virtue of being material action, material. So the way you should sort of conceptualize it is just like when they say affect or praxis, think knowledge production. So yeah, another sort of way, another example that's not in the card that I think really clearly elucidates this link is the difference between like actual BLM members and, well, I mean by actual BLM members, I mean like people dedicated to the cause, and opportunists. And what I mean by that is there's obviously a very clear difference between rioting and looting as a way to disrupt systems of power versus rioting and looting just because it makes you feel good, right? Which either you can use as like an example of how the link operates, or you can use it to paint a distinction between the 1AC and the 1NC insofar as the app has some sort of example related to BLM. So it's sort of dependent. Obviously, the more specific examples you have that illustrate the same point, the better. And this is a really good way to frame out the permutation. The biggest issue with the CapK is the permutation. AF teams don't actually have a stable advocacy they defend. Usually they defend a praxis, i.e. a form of knowledge production, which inevitably lets them re-articulate what that entails in the 2AC to get out of 1NC links, in the 1AR to get out of 2NC links, and in the 2AR to get out of 2NR links. This is a warrant for why KFs don't get permutations that I'll touch upon a little bit later, but it's also a reason you should make it very clear what parts of the 1EC you are disagreeing with so as to prevent them from doing that. The way you should articulate mutual exclusivity with a link like this is by saying we are mutually exclusive in the way that we have theorized resistance should take place. The 1AC or 2AC has taken a specific stance about how organizing should take place, i.e. they've said that we should prioritize affect when organizing, or we should base organizing on knowledge production. We are impact turning that. Our argument is that organizing should be based in material action. And that will sort of be a little bit clearer when I go down the specific impacts you can read with this link. The first impact that works pretty well and is sort of a catch-all is de-radicalization. The argument here is that their politics abdicate the need to actually go and do material action because they set the threshold for resistance extremely low. This is especially good versus affirmatives that conflate things like knowledge production and revolution, or they claim things in cross-ex like vote app if it's a good idea. Your argument is that the idea that simply getting up and saying that imperialism, NATO, or whatever apps are critiquing on this topic is bad constitutes some form of revolutionary action or is itself inherently a form of organizing is exactly the sort of assumption that we're critiquing. The fact that they have no actual plan to, one, actually achieve this organizing, or two, translate their praxis into material action, not only like takes out most of their solvency claims, because obviously getting up and saying that NATO is bad doesn't stop NATO from intervening in places like Libya, but also it's actively dangerous because the AF incentivizes people to do things like, get arrested in non-strategic ways. Another turns case argument you can make with this impact is something like focusing on affect means that people will just sell out for clout. And the clearest way to visualize this is something like the 1AC has defended a form of mutual aid. And the way we build that aid is through relationalities. The way you can analogize this is like, obviously you can quote unquote relate to mutual aid by liking something on Twitter. But if we base politics on how many Twitter likes we get, then obviously we just do things like, betray our comrades or sell out if it meant getting more Twitter likes, because you've made that the sort of sole prerogative of politics. And yeah, you can get these links to cross-sects really easily. Something that I like to do, and I sort of touched upon this earlier, is literally just ask them what the AF does. And either they can't tell you and they lose the debate because this link is like perfect versus that, or they can tell you and now you've actually forced them to defend something. So there's no more like KF shenanigans they can get away with, which makes your life a lot easier. Few implications of this impact. First, it turns the perm. This is one of my favorite arguments to go for. There's no incentive to actually go and do dual power organizing, which is the alt, when we can just get up and read truisms. Obviously, when the AF has made the claim that there's no difference between something like material resistance or revolution and reading a 1AC, there's actually no reason to go and do, the nitty-gritty aspects of dual power organizing if we can get the sort of same benefits from something like reading a 1AC. And this argument is supercharged by any 2AC argument that talks about labor or makes a claim that the party is like really hard and that organizing is really tedious. You can get up in your speech and be like, the fact that they villainize organizing in such a way and try to emphasize how tedious it is proves that in the world of permutation, people will always just choose the easier, more affectively appealing option, which means there's no actual way to, go about dual power organizing because we need incentives for people to actually do those things. I don't think that argument is particularly strong unless the 2AC gets up and makes the labor argument I was just talking about. But an argument that I do think is particularly strong is articulating the folk politics link as an internal link turn to any 2AC disad about the party failing or being co-opted by white liberals. So what you can do in the case where a 2AC gets up and is like, oh, everyone's like a Twitter communist or everyone's a faux revolutionary, and that means the party fails, get up in the 2NC, be like, that's literally you. Like our folk politics link is literally about how you're a white liberal or you're a faux revolutionary, which proves that their sort of offense links to the permutation, not the alternative. Obviously, don't say this versus an AF about identity. You have to be very strategic with how you choose to characterize the AF in relation to the literature base. And this is an argument, or I guess a point I can't stress enough. You lose and win debates based on your affect. And what your affect means in this context is based on the way you present yourself. Obviously, if the app is a bunch of homo jargon, you can go like a little bit aggro and be like, what the fuck does any of this do? Like, how is this supposed to reconcile anything? But if the app is like, an identity app or an app about someone's personal survival strategy, you aren't going to win the debate by like being super douchebaggy. You have to be very strategic with how you package your arguments and how you tell the story of the K, right? For instance, let's say you have an app that's like, we have XYZ survival strategy for me and my partner. You're going to lose the debate if your link is that you don't do anything for anyone else, you're selfish. You're probably going to win the debate if your link argument is about how, collective resistance is preferable to individual forms of resistance, right? So even if you're making the same argument theoretically, the way you phrase it and articulate it is extremely important. Because if the 1AR is in a position where it can point to a line or moment in the 2NC to illustrate or I guess link you to their offense, you're probably going to lose the debate. And another implication, well, I guess that's that rant for now. Another good part about this link is that it turns any social energy argument. What social energy is in the context of CapK is you should think about it as like the motivation to go and do organizing. Social energy is a way of saying the affirmative creates incentives for people to go and do organizing. It creates an impetus for action. Your argument is sort of twofold. One, yes, the 1EC might create social energy, i.e. it might motivate people to do organizing, but our whole point is that they have no actual tactic or form of organizing to expend that social energy into by virtue of them being folk political, i.e. there's no material action that their praxis can lead to because their praxis wasn't made to lead to material action in the first place. The second argument is that the social energy they create, even if it becomes an actual movement or takes the form of material action, is bad, which was the sort of examples about dangerous organizing that I explained above. The second impact is a little bit similar to the first, but it differs in the way you articulate it. It's repetition compulsion, which some of you might know is like a psychoanalysis term, but that's not how it's used in this context. This is just a fancy way of saying that people become obsessed with the act of protesting in and of itself. Hold up, my camera froze. I'm gonna fix that. All right, that is a fancy way of saying that people become obsessed with the act of protesting in and of itself, which ensures they never accomplish anything. A really good way to elucidate this argument, and my camera froze again, sorry. A really good way to elucidate this argument is you should ask them about a movement that the 1EC looks like. Ask them for a material example of Affs solvency. They're going to name a group, right? Obviously, this group has to have already existed. And the way you sort of use that strategically is by asking them, well, okay, you haven't told me what the 1EC looks like. You've given me an example of how other people have sort of used the politics of the 1EC. Obviously, those people didn't succeed. That's why you're up here reading the Affs. So what does the 1EC do that's different from these movements? Or what analysis does the 1EC add that sort of prevents, you know, like their strategy from meeting the same end as those movements, for example, i.e. the 1EC has defended the BPP as a solvency example. That's cool. What analysis does the 1EC add to prevent things like the CIA getting access to their strategies and, you know, having a counter-insurgency operation? How does the 1EC combat against that? There's two ways they can answer. One, they can answer that question. If it's convincing, like move on, I guess. You have other arguments at your disposal. But two, any risk they can't answer that question puts them in a really, really bad spot. Because now they've given you a free presumption argument, right? Because if the Aff is exactly the same as a movement that has already failed, then obviously it's not going to overcome any structural barriers that allow it to succeed, which is like an inherency argument. You can say the Aff is non-inherent, right? It's incapable of sort of overcoming the same issues that the movement they named had, so it can't solve. That was a little bit like over-explaining, but the TLDR is that you name a group, that group failed, you don't explain what you do different, you also failed, GG, presumption. But the way that the Aff will answer this argument is by saying something like, more discussions about the Aff are good. We should talk more about the Aff. We need to test and refine our praxis to avoid these things. This is your link argument. This is what I was talking about earlier when I say you can garner links to their performance, either cross-ex moments or 2AC arguments. Your impact articulation should be about how the Aff becomes an endless cycle of knowledge production for its own sake, because the goal of the 1AC is producing knowledge, not actually using it pragmatically, i.e. You can ask them in CX about what their movement looks like or what their praxis materializes as. I explained that earlier. Another sort of impact argument you can make that attaches to this is like a co-option argument. That's like the fact that their method is devoid of material action ensures that capitalism can co-opt it to dismiss the necessity of structural change. And a really good example that we used in TOC round 2, sorry, loss of BG, was one about how capitalism permits indigenous study groups in places like academia, but cracks down on protesters in the real world. The 1AC is just like a form of pacification that abdicates the need for material action, which proves mutual exclusivity because there's no way the party can actually go and organize in a world of the 1AC, right? So that's that. The two implications here, one, this argument turns to perm. you shouldn't get a perm. If we win, you do nothing. This is the ultimate two in our grandstand moment where you're like, listen, we said the Aff does nothing. They haven't answered that. Why the hell would you give them a perm? Right? And the more offensive way to frame this, and this is also about packaging, is not saying they don't get a perm, they do nothing, but packaging it in a way that lets you sort of weaponize the fact that they do nothing, i.e., you can get up and be like, the fact that they do nothing, but want you to vote for the permutation regardless is bad for XYZ reason. An argument that we went for that was sort of successful, I guess it depends on your judge, is something about parasitism, i.e. the affirmative is parasitic upon the alternative because, you know, it like uses the material gains of the alternative to justify their movement. A lot of judges said that wording was too extreme, so I would sort of tinker with the way you articulate that. But I feel like the better argument here is that the 1AC, either when it makes this permutation argument or when it makes an argument about how people have different roles in revolution, displaces the burden of material action onto everyone else, right? Which is one, infinitely aggressive. Obviously, the 1AC, if the 1AC just gets up and says, yeah, we don't do anything, but the alt does, so perm, you should be like, yeah, but you never actually, like, there's no incentive to go and do material things in the world of the perm, so like, obviously the perm fails. But two, it also turns all their labor arguments or any arguments they make about battle fatigue or exhaustion, because the 1AC is never going to be able to materially provide for anyone because they're only focused on creating that praxis. And insofar as no one actually goes and materializes that praxis, then everyone the 1AC said needs care or needs mutual aid will never receive it absent the alternative. Another argument you can make with this link is just like impact turn any ballot key claims. Just be like attaching significance to the repetition of squirrel politics, like proves the link about repetition compulsion. And another way you can use this to implicate the perm is being like, they create nothing new. They're just repeating old politics, which means they've misused social energy, which is like a linear disad, meaning that there's a finite amount of social energy. We can only motivate a limited amount of people to do a limited amount of things. And insofar as they've motivated people to do the wrong things, then that's the reason our methods trade off, or why, you know, you should vote negative because we're comparatively better. So that last part, that last link explanation was a bit of a doozy because these arguments are very similar, but also have different implications. If there are any specific questions, I'll answer them now before I move on to the next link.
I guess one question I had is, what do you mean by social energy?
So what I mean by social energy, I sort of explained this above, but that might have just gotten bogged down by all the other explaining I've been doing. Social energy just means impetus for action, i.e. when the Affs says they create social energy, it means they create a reason for people to go and do organizing. They motivate people to actually take part in politics, i.e. energy for motivation, social for politics. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Also, I think your camera froze again.
Yeah, okay, I just fixed that. All right, so this next link is a lot more simple. And that's why my screen won't be full of text. The next link argument is the localism / universalism link, which is the Hester evidence. I think everyone has seen this card. There are two ways to utilize this link. The first way you can utilize this link is to draw a distinction between individualism and collectivism. And this is about the scope and scale of the affirmative and the sort of burden they've set for themselves. The question you should ask yourself when you try to understand this link is, what do we base our politics off of? What should be our blueprint for organizing? 1NC Hester makes a couple of arguments here. The first argument 1NC Hester makes is that the reason that fascists are so successful in the status quo is because there's no one institution people can get the resources they need to fight back. There's no support networks that are capable of materially providing things to help people survive outside of capitalism. And the reason why that's the case is because politics have become increasingly particularized. There are a bunch of different groups in the status quo with no way to actually consolidate their goals, right? And that's what Hester, no way to consolidate their goals, right? And the term you should use when explaining this in your 2NC is you should be like, the Aff has no way to unite these disparate struggles. You need some sort of praxis or method for organizing that allows you to enable multiple groups who disagree on a lot of things to come together and resist capitalism. The reason that's good is, one, Obviously, if all these groups come together, the mass of the movement is going to be a lot bigger, which means it's more likely to succeed in an anti-capitalist revolution. And the second reason is that this stops these groups from fragmenting. The reason fragmentation is bad is because it makes it a hell of a lot easier for fascists to crack down. I.e., let's say fascists like militarize a bunch of white supremacists. It's a lot easier to go and take down a bunch of random movements who have no way to coordinate with each other or share information than it is to take down a large consolidated network of different movements who not only share information with each other, but also are capable of, fighting back, not only through the sheer scale of that movement, but also to the resources they have access to. And a good way to frame this in debates is you can just have an argument that's like, fascist leaders are mobilizing white supremacists. There are neo-Nazis in the status quo who are collectively organizing and planning to do things like take down municipal centers. We need a politics that can match the scope and scale of that, i.e., collectivist politics, right? So that's just the reason why universalism is good. The way you generate links based off this is by impact turning things like individualism. The way you get individualism links is either A, the Aff will make an argument that's like, all we need to win is that the Aff is good for us, to which you say, well, no, because politics shouldn't be about what's good and what's not good for us. Politics should be about collective organizing towards an anti-capitalist future. And the second way you can get the individualism-based links is that Affs will have some sort of argument in the 1AC for how we should have resistance take place. Either they'll be like, we should use our own struggles as a blueprint for resistance, to which you'll be like, everyone's lived experiences are different. We need a universalizable aspect of struggle to bring people together. And that's basically it. The reason the individualism link is so good is because it impact turns or internal link. One second.
While I didn't gone, I guess, do any of y'all have any questions that you're wondering about this lecture? Feel free to either DM me individually and then I can ask Aidan them, or just say them out loud.
All right, that's my bad. I'm back. Where was I? I was saying the reason that this link is so good is because it gets you access to really good internal link turn and impact turns to common Aff arguments. For instance, let's say they make the social energy argument versus this link, right? The 2AC will say, we create social energy through care. The 2NC will say, we have won that your politics. Okay, my camera keeps beeping. The 2NC would say, if we win that your politics are individualistic, that means two things. One, there's no actual incentive to care for each other insofar as politics becomes about the self. And two, the forms of care you produce are incapable of attending to certain needs because the way you conceptualize care should take place is not based on some common thing that all people and movements have in common. It's based on your own lived experiences. And obviously your own needs are different from the needs of people who are super poor and can't put food on their table. People require different forms of care, different manifestations of strategies, and only the alternatives analysis can attend to those things, right? Insofar as universalism is true. And a really good example that I like to use is basically Marxism is obviously a science, right? Or rather, I guess the way you can frame it is Marxism isn't one contingent demand. Marxism isn't that just we should end capitalism by revolution. Marxism is a science that people can apply to their struggles as a way to either increase the percentage chance of success against capitalism or organize in such a way that allows us to best challenge systems of power. That's exactly the reason why white college students can employ a Marxist analysis by doing things like raising funds, donating money to certain groups, or protesting, whereas groups in the Philippines who don't have access to that capital in the first place can't do those things. Yet they can still apply the basic tenets of Marxism to do things like create political education programs or teach self-defense classes. Our point is that the fact that everyone needs different things, or rather the way you should frame it is that the fact that everyone needs different things is only a reason why universalism is good, because we have presented an analytic frame that allows us to attend to all the different needs that people may have, which means that when they get up and they call you reductionist, you're like, no, we're the exact opposite. You're the reductionist one, right? And that's especially true if you go like a step farther and you're like, you're a reductionist because you think that all politics should be based on your lived experiences. Here's like our link argument. But yeah, I just think those two arguments are extremely persuasive. And you can just get super nuanced with them, right? Which is essentially how you win debates. The second thing it can link into is universalism versus, or the second way you should conceptualize this link is universalism versus particularism, which I sort of just like started rambling about towards the end. But another way you should imply this argument is a question of what we're struggling against and a question of how we consolidate roles, right? A way you can fish for links is you ask someone when you see cross-sects, what do you do with people who disagree with you? And they'll be like, oh, well, we can just turn away from them, right? They don't need to agree with us. Our whole argument, actually, wait, scratch that. I'll explain that argument on the alt. That's probably a better place for it. A way you can fish for like universalism versus particularism links is by looking at the 1AC and looking at the way it analyzes like structures of power, i.e. if the Affs is like the Luz or some other POMO like nonsense, it's going to be like power takes all these different shapes and forms, yada, 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 yada. You'd be like, sure, the issue with this is that it makes combating capitalism or combating power extremely hard because they force us to develop a super particularized strategy versus each and everything, which not only means that those strategies will lack the scope and scale because not as many people can participate in those movements, but also means that capitalism will inevitably crack down on those strategies because they're fragmented, i.e. insofar as there's like 50 groups struggling against like 50 manifestations of power or whatnot, then power itself can just, i.e. capitalism, can just go and take out those 50 groups one by one. And the sort of way, another useful tip for understanding this argument, actually, yeah, I won't explain that until the alt because there's like a whole section for the alt and it's really important and I don't want to repeat myself. But something you should keep in mind versus links, and I should have touched upon this at the very top, but I forgot because I didn't have it written down, is that you should frame the debate in the 2NR based on the link argument you're going for. Insofar as you have two link arguments, you have a link argument to the way that the affirmative has theorized praxis, or okay, actually, you have a link argument to the way the affirmative has theorized organizing should take place, which is your folk politics link. And then you have a link argument to the way that the 1AC has theorized, or the way that the 1AC's praxis might materialize itself. So that's like a link argument to something like communes, right? Like the localism link is good versus Affs. It's like we should have spaces outside of capitalism. We should have like these zones of care. That's like, I guess, like the more material part of 1AC solvency that you can generate offense to via the localism link. Whereas the immaterial parts of 1AC solvency, you can generate offense to based on the folk politics link. And the reason that's important is that the way you should do line by line with the cap and answer Aff arguments is through the lens of your link arguments. You should look at the 2AC, look at all the arguments you have written down on your flow, and group the arguments into two categories. The first category is folk political. The second category is localist. Then, when you're constructing your 2NC, you should have an extension of your localism link or folk politics link, whichever one you want first, wherever they make their first argument. Then you should implicate that argument through the lens of the link. So if it's a social energy argument, you can have an argument that's like, if they make an argument that's like, care is good for social energy, what you can say is, here's our folk politics link. Then on the line by line, you'd be like, the 2AC says social energy, folk politics turns this, the social energy they create is bad. And then you can insert the impact module about them creating bad forms of organizing, or you can insert the impact module about how the social energy they create never gets expended into material action and why that's bad, right? So that's a really strategic way to get your cake and eat it too, i.e. to have all of these different impacts for your link, and you get to read all of them because you just do them on the line by line, as opposed to having a link argument and you're like, there are 3 impacts of this link argument. That's super inefficient and probably not worth the time trade-off in the long run. Another reason why this is really, really good is because it makes a 1AR extremely hard, because Now they're not answering just line by line. They're answering literally mini link arguments that have an internal link and impact, which makes their job a lot harder. And in the 2NR, it's a lot easier for you to get up and win, because let's say they drop an impact module, then you characterize your link through the lens of that impact module. I.e., if they drop the repetition compulsion impact, you go for the link argument and you frame it as a repetition compulsion link. If they drop the stuff about bad organizing, you go for the folk politics link and you read it as like a bad organizing link, whatever. I'm sure that makes sense. Also, that just makes you a lot better and more nuanced in your analysis, because your 2NR will actually sound like a story, because you have this narrative and you're framing all of their offense through that narrative. I.e., you have this narrative that's like the Affs has fallen for the trap of individualism, right? Or you have this narrative that's the Affs is too localist in nature and unable to confront fascism, etc. That makes framing the debate really easy for you. That makes understanding your arguments really easy for the judge. And that makes it very, very, very sort of compelling to vote negative, because you have all these moving parts that you have consolidated extremely well by virtue of your responses to 2AC arguments being couched in your links. All right, any questions before I move on to the alt? All right, I'll take that as a no. So I know I've been rambling a lot, but I'm probably gonna ramble the most here. But this should be a little bit more structured, because I'll just go down the most important arguments. So what is the alt with the CapK? The alternative is dual power organizing, which is the 1NC Escalante evidence in the file on the Discord. The argument essentially is that there's this Vanguard party that recruits people by providing them services, be it food, water, clothes, political education, etc. These are material incentives that can create disinvestment from the system by showing the masses the failures of capitalism. I.e., if there's like a place with no food and the Communist Party comes there and gives them food because it grew it from agricultural programs, that will not only create an investment in the party as a form of organizing, but that will also reverse causally show people that capitalism has failed them, but communism hasn't. What a vanguard is essentially the leaders of a movement. And a really, really good argument that I heard from Reed that I think is just super smart is that the difference between a fascist vanguard and a revolutionary one is how honest you are about your leadership. Because inevitably in any movement, even if you claim to quote unquote not have leaders, there are inevitably going to be a set of people that members will turn to, right? That's intrinsically true, because if their movement is literally just everyone do what they want, that A, links into your individualism offense, and B, ensures they can't get anything accomplished, which is a very, very compelling narrative for the 2NR. Read the alt debate. So essentially, insofar as it is true that every movement has leadership, only being very explicit about that leadership, i.e. the alternative admitting that it's literally a vanguard, can allow your movement to be held accountable. Because if your movement has a bunch of leaders, but you lie and say it doesn't, then when your movement goes and does messed up stuff, there's no one to actually pin the blame to or hold accountable. And a good example of this is like this anarchist group that were clearly very coordinated and had a cell structure because all of them wore like black clothes, right? And they wore all black. They went into this like black area, rioted, broke everything up. And when, black people tried to hold them accountable because they were the ones who had to clean up all their shit, they didn't know who to actually turn to, because that movement, by virtue of it calling itself anarchist, wouldn't explicitly say who led them and who didn't, right? Which is also a reason the alternative is good and why their offense links to the permutation or the affirmative as opposed to the alt. Another thing is that your alt block should be really short. Your explanation for how the alternative functions should be done on the dissats, which is literally what I just did when I explained that example, because this allows you to maximize your efficiency and your nuance, right? And this is especially true if you have really Affs-specific alt solvency examples. And I could just name a few. So we debated this trans identity Aff, RKS quarters. We had these 3 examples about like the party providing resources for trans people that were like the Cuban government gives free gender affirming surgeries to trans people. The Communist Party of the Philippines was the first organization to legally recognize gay marriage. Alison Escalante, same person who wrote the 1NC, was able to afford top surgery because of crowdfunding, right? having examples like that not only makes you a lot more ethosy and cross-ex, because then they'll be like, what does a party do? And then you answer with those 3 things and they just look kind of stupid. But also it's just going to make it a lot easier to get out of their disads and impact turns. Because if their impact turn is the party doesn't do anything and you have 3 examples of it obviously doing something, then their offense is ahistorical and probably isn't going to win them the round because it's just blatantly not true. I feel like another thing that's extremely important is the way that cap debaters lose a lot of rounds in the alt is playing defense. So they're going to make arguments about accountability and about how the party has historically been racist. If your 2NC answer is that the party, if you only say the party isn't racist, it's really bad for you because any risk that it is sufficient to vote Aff. You shouldn't couch the debate on terminal defense. You need to have some sort of offensive argument on the accountability mechanisms debate that not only perceptually makes your defense seem a lot stronger, but also gives you an impact you can actually leverage against theirs. So I'm going to ramble about accountability mechanisms now. And this is like the most important part of the CapK. So even if you like had your headset off the entire time and you're like, whatever, I'll just read the same links that I do and go for like class first, yada, 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 yada. You should pay attention now because I'm about to give you the actual sauce, right? So there are a few arguments for accountability mechanisms. I'll just go straight down in the way that I think your 2NC should be structured. The first argument you should have on the alt dissad debate is a framing issue. You need a reason for the affirmative links to your disads harder. Either be it they have no mechanism to determine leadership, they have no basis for membership, they have no accountability mechanism in it of itself, i.e. the Aff hasn't explained how they kick people out, who they let in, which means that there's only a risk that the alternative is better than the affirmative, right? Now your argument isn't just like, yeah, but the alt probably isn't racist. Your argument is that the affirmative is actively worse for all the reasons that they have said the alt is bad. Because obviously accountability mechanisms are better than no accountability mechanisms, right? Like having a way to kick out people who are sexist or racist is better than not having a way to do that. Having a way to determine membership is better than a way of not having to do that, right? So there's literally, again, I'll repeat it because it's an important turn, only a risk. The alt is better than Aff. You should also have a link turn argument. That's sort of your catch-all. You should say that even if the Aff wins, that these mechanisms on the alternative are imperfect now. Democratic centralism, which means like public debate over what the party should do, that everyone can participate in, be it a leader who's part of a Vanguard or a member, allows for discussions that inevitably reshape the party and accountability mechanisms in the right direction. In order to make this argument even better, you can add a line that's like, especially true when the 2AC says debate is a site to develop strategies. The accountability mechanisms debate proper, a term that I really like to use, rather a phrase, is something like every warrant we win is external offense against case in the perm. I think that accountability mechanisms bad is one of the most astrategic things that KAFs do because it gets them into a spot where it's really hard to shift out of your offense because the permutation does not shield your impact. What I mean by that is they can win that the permutation avoids the net benefit, i.e. they can have some argument about like how the perm is like anti whatever and win that that's good. But ultimately, they cannot win that the permutation solves an impact like fascism or warming in a world where they have explicitly rejected accountability mechanisms. What that means, reverse causally, is that if you win, the alternative needs accountability mechanisms, needs a vanguard to actually become the revolutionary struggle capable of overthrowing capitalism, then the fact that the permutation doesn't have those things by virtue of their impact turn, it means it will never be able to solve our offense. That turns the debate into a what's worse, fascism or insert net benefit to the perm here, which you should probably always win because your impacts are higher magnitude, your impacts have a turn case argument, and rarely do Affs have any explanatory power for fascism that capitalism, that the CapK doesn't have a better internal link to, right? So the way you should do the accountability mechanisms debate is you shouldn't fight them on historical examples. That's a losing battle. The 2AC will never get up and be like, they kicked Claudia Johnson out of the party, they did this, they did that, these past parties are bad. You need to be like, yeah, that's our point. These past parties are bad, but that's not what we have defended. A really good trick for the 2NC is to defend very hyper-specific procedures that people just cannot generate offense to. The procedures that we like to defend are things like confidential struggle sessions where everyone with a stake in proceedings can present evidence and make decisions about what happens to people involved, strong community networks that allow us to protect victims, and command structures that can steer crowds away from bad organizations, right? Obviously, there's no reason for why these specific procedures are bad for organizing, let alone racist or sexist. So any risk you win the alt solves outweighs the risk of a DA. But also, it's also it just allows you to reframe the debate in a very strategic way, because now the fact that they have 2NC examples is completely useless, because your whole point is that, like, yeah, the Communist Party of 2018 was bad. Our 1NC card wasn't, we endorsed the Communist Party of 2018, right? And I also feel that's just like perceptually an argument that a judge would probably buy. Like, there's no reason they would stick you to a movement that's not you, unless they're a bad judge, in which case it's not the cap case fault, you lost. Another argument you can make is that only the alt has a mechanism to determine leadership. Democratic centralism, which is a form of public debate I mentioned above, allows people to have their voices heard in the party, but the Affs has no way to actually ensure that happens. An argument that they'd like to make is that, oh, when you couch everything in terms of materiality and in terms of communism, then the party will allow racists and sexists to stay in the party as long as they're good communists. This argument is not true. The way you answer it is by saying the party doesn't prioritize efficiency over racism/sexism within it. That's a line you should write down, because it's a very quick way of getting across your point. You can use examples strategically here, where you're like, the African People's Socialist Party, put Black organizers at the top. Or, this is a very, very, very good example, especially versus this argument, Red Bloom, who kicked out their leader, Austin Yorkin, because he had discriminatory recruiting practices. This disproves the thesis of their arguments. And another quick one-liner that's really good to add and really good to have in a cross-sex moment, they'll make an argument that's like, the party is mostly white people or whatever. You should be like, wait, you realize that most Marxist groups globally aren't white, let alone American. So this argument is just like, the Affs argument is just like so ahistorical, and you can really clown them on it, right? So they'll be like, white people have numerical majority in the party. And you're just like, that, and you're just like, this is like ridiculous, right? Yeah. So I think that's pretty much all you should need on the accountability mechanism side of the debate. But another argument you should be prepared to answer that I've sort of been hinting at but not explicitly referencing is the reductionism argument. When 2ACs say class reductionism, their argument is that it's basically like a root cause bad argument. The way you get out of it is by saying that you haven't said that capitalism is the root cause of their offense. Rather, the alternative analyzes the intersections between race, gender, and class as a way to produce effective organizing. This is a defensive argument. Saying this in the 2NC gets you defense. So how do we turn it into an offensive argument? Well, the way you do that is by going the extra step and saying, theorizing their impacts as completely detached from capitalism is more reductionist, which in turn link turns their argument. And a step further, you should say you can like evaluate or frame class-based violence as an external impact, right? The second argument here is a no link. Say we haven't made a root cause claim. We acknowledge that like XYZ people experience X impact differently globally. That's our alt uniqueness claim. Identifying universalizable aspects of struggle is key to unite them across shared lines of interest, which is the example I gave about Marxism in the context of white college students and Marxism in the context of like Philippine, like revolutionaries in the Philippines. Another reason this argument is like pretty good is that it's like pretty true. Most struggles globally, whether they be, you know, anti-patriarchy, decolonial, etc., are all positioned in a way that's anti-capitalist. Either the movement that they have defended or the movements they defend are inherently anti-capitalist, which means that obviously the alt's method of organizing is good because they have spotted us that capitalism, the struggle against capitalism, is the only universalizable aspect of all these struggles. But also, if those movements aren't struggling against capitalism and they think that capitalism is good and the Affs has defended them, like that's your link argument, impactor and that shit. All right. So I guess let's like basically all I have for the alt stuff. I didn't have most of that written down. So like if you're curious about it, I can just send you my blocks after the lecture or whatever. But there's just a few more things I want to go through. Actually, I basically went through all these on like the link and alt section. So are there any specific questions that people have?
Here, I'm gonna
Listen or
stop the
anything.
recording real quick.